Good morning, everyone. And let me thank you all for being here. To the members of our community, our distinguished members of our community, stakeholders, thank you all as well for being here. There isn't a mayor in this nation that can't deliver these remarks that I'm about to deliver as well. Beth McCann, thank you for being here as well, our district attorney. The indignation over the killing of George Floyd and the condemnation of the violence that took place last night. This is an easy message to begin to construct for any mayor around this country. But I want to provide some additional comments that I believe as a community are important to be said. The phrase "I can't breathe" means something very different to my children and to the young people who are demonstrating. These are the final mortal words of George Floyd, of Eric Gardner, Ahmaud Arbery. May have been the very last words of Trayvon Martin, and so many others that have been at the forefront of the consciousness and the pain and frustration that is built up all over this nation. We understand that. You know, as an African-American man growing up in this nation, as a father, as an uncle, now as a grandfather, it is real to us. We get it. It's a great deal of pain. I know that pain. I know that frustration. Director Murphy Robinson knows that frustration. Chief Pazen knows that frustration. We have talked about it as men growing up in this community. We also recognize that we need to channel this pain, to demand change, to work for progress, and to make improvements in our community and throughout this nation. And that's why yesterday, in a conversation that preceded the protests that took place at the Capitol by several hours, the three of us were on the phone, and we resolved that we needed to support the public protests and demonstrations. I am proud that you stand up and want to hold people accountable for these types of actions. We stand with you. We need to encourage, however, peaceful demonstrations. Like many in our community, I am outraged at the senseless murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. His life matters. I am proud that many in Denver have wanted to join the chorus of those across the country demanding justice and consequences for his life being taken too early. When individuals choose the path of violence, however, it drowns out the peaceful cries for change. All people will see is the violence and not the cause people are standing for. This morning we wake up not talking about the need for the continuation for swift justice and investigation into the loss of life of George Floyd. No, we see headlines about the violent protests that occurred in our city and in other cities across this nation. When this happens time and time again, we should be beyond such things that are things that we see in our nation that we believe we should be beyond. We will protest loudly and continue to make our voices heard. We must continue to stand united and rise above the actions that have incited our communities. That is how communities have effected change time after time. But we must never turn on one another. Our police officers were prepared yesterday to support the demonstration and let the people voice their collective outrage peacefully so that it would be heard. When these events turn from peaceful demonstrations to groups of people lashing out in violence, we lose the initiative to create the change we demand. Again, the message today, the headlines are about the violent protests and not about the injustice that was directed and prematurely ended the life of George Floyd. So as we go forward, we will take extra precautions for future protests on this issue. We will hold people accountable if they look to hijack people's pain for their own violent purposes. This is my opinion, not the chief's, not Director Murphy, unless they want to join in. But for what we saw, for the most part, yesterday started out as a peaceful demonstration that was infiltrated by others who decided to push their own agenda, to disrupt, and to incite. For the last 3 months, as we have weathered the storm of a horrific pandemic, where countless frontline workers have put their lives at risk protecting all of us, unfortunately, they had to don their riot gear to bring peace in what should have been a peaceful demonstration. The road to recovery is before us, and all of us, Black, Latino, Asian, and white, all of us must continue to work to recover together. I want to thank our police officers for the strength and the restraint that they showed yesterday. I want to thank our sheriff deputies for their efforts as well, our EMS workers, our firefighters, who went from working the front lines on the COVID challenge to dealing with a demonstration that turned violent last night. I want to thank the demonstrators who showed up for a peaceful demonstration, to have their voices heard, to push back on the injustice that we all have continued to witness throughout this nation, and to call for closer, tighter relationship between the police and the communities, and the honoring of the sanctity of life of all men and women in our communities. The chief will talk about the ongoing investigations, about the shots that were fired, cars destroyed, car chasings. But I want you to understand something. It doesn't mean that we should stand silent when injustice occurs. Nothing I said preempts that value. Whether that injustice occurred in Minneapolis or in Georgia or in our nation's capital, we do not stand silent. That's not who we are as a society or as a people, and certainly not from the community I was raised in. We move, we act with respect, we create change together. There's still the sickness of racism in our country that needs to be cured once and for all. More than ever, we need to all pull together because we can remake this world together, guided by equity and tolerance and justice. And so I want to summarize the thoughts of this city before Chief Pazen comes up. We will stand ready again to support peaceful demonstrations, but we will not tolerate violence and damage to personal and public property. It is a tough situation. We get it, but we must demonstrate peacefully. I can tell you not to go out and to demonstrate, but the reality is it's going to happen. And if it's going to happen, we're not encouraging people. We're going to let it happen. And though we're not encouraging people to gather, we're going to allow it to happen. We ask you to do it peacefully and ask you to do it safely. Once again, we remind everyone, the coronavirus is still very much in our community. And if you're out there to demonstrate, to have your voices heard, we get it. Exercise physical and social distancing. Wear your face covering. And again, demonstrate peacefully. I ask you to keep in your minds the family of George Floyd, who we all know can imagine that they are experiencing unspeakable pain right now for the loss of a soul that they cherished. But let's not, in Denver, Colorado, or in Los Angeles, or in Minneapolis, anywhere in this nation, let not the story be about the riots and the protests. Let's keep the focus on the life that was lost and the hope that we all hope, the change that we all hope to see happen in our communities. Thank you, and I want to bring Chief Paul Pazen up.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I'd like to address a couple of things. The situation in Minneapolis. I, along with members of this department, send our condolences to the family and loved ones of George Floyd. Our heart hurts just as much as this community and the community in Minnesota. I'd also like to talk about the incident last night. We respect people's right to protest and the freedom of speech, and we have demonstrated our support for our community's right to be heard. Protests like this one, we encourage to be done safely. We provide officers to ensure that our protesters can get from point A to point B safely. We block traffic. We work with organizers to help them get their message heard. However, last night, when the protest crossed over into destructive, dangerous, and criminal behavior that is no longer acceptable, and it requires law enforcement intervention. I also want to commend the women and men of the Denver Police Department who demonstrated extreme restraint last night as they became the target of people's rage and anger. They performed in an exemplary manner in order to control a very disruptive and dangerous situation, a situation that put lives of our residents, lives of the people of Denver in danger. What started off as a peaceful protest, unfortunately, quickly devolved into violence and vandalism. Around 5:30 p.m. last night, we had gunfire at the state capitol. Police officers from the Denver Police Department, as well as troopers from the Colorado State Patrol, quickly responded in order to try to locate and mitigate this situation. We continue to investigate this in hopes of bringing the individual responsible for this dangerous and violent behavior to justice. Unfortunately, we did not locate anybody last night. However, the investigation continues. After this shooting, we had many of the protesters scatter, and we had a group that marched towards I-25. As you can imagine, this is very dangerous. It's very dangerous for our protesters to access the highway where we have vehicles traveling at high rates of speed. It's dangerous for the protesters, and it's dangerous for our community that is not expecting pedestrians to be on the highway. Officers were able to quickly engage with these protesters who were on both lanes, north and southbound I-25, and get the highway cleared. As these unlawful behaviors continued throughout the evening, the danger to our residents and our officers became greater. This was caused primarily by a few agitators within the group that were throwing rocks, setting fires, and causing damage to our business community. In response, our officers deployed less lethal weapons as a means to disperse the crowd. This lasted early into this morning. Overall, we had 3 officers that sustained injury, one of which was transported to the hospital and is doing fine as we speak. There were a total of 13 arrests for incidences involving burglary, criminal mischief, and assault. Our officers showed great restraint throughout the evening and only took action when dangerous situations occurred. As we move into this weekend, please know that we continue to respect the First Amendment and individuals' right for free speech and assembly. We will continue to work with organizers to help them have their voices heard in a safe manner. It is our responsibility to keep Denver safe for all residents, all protesters, and all police officers. As we continue, we will treat those we serve with respect and dignity. We are committed to respecting and protecting dignity, safety, and the rights of all our community members. And we ask that everyone do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Before we open it up, I want to again thank many of our community members who are here, who weighed in this morning, last night and this morning, offering their support. I want to certainly thank the Honorable Wellington Webb and Honorable Wilma Webb for being here, for your leadership, and always the example, symbol of these type of situations. You might recall in '93 where Mayor Webb had to stand in the middle of a public demonstration. And he's much taller than I am. He was seen, I would not have been. But that was a demonstration of courage and leadership that someone growing up in the city will never forget. Let's open up for question and answer.
Chief Pazen, did you think cops followed the use of force policy in light of protesters saying they were shot with tear gas and pepper balls were shot at them? Can you comment on that?
So, Estevan, great to see you. Let's talk about the use of force policy in the first place. This is a policy, and it demonstrates what Denver is all about and what this police department is all about. The Denver Police Department use of force policy was created by this community, and it was created in a proactive way so we can prevent tragedies. As far as last night, our officers reacted to violent and dangerous behavior. Rocks being hurled at them, assaultive behavior, protecting members of our community, and we will review each incident, we will review each complaint. But I want to acknowledge the fact that this very strong and progressive use of force policy was created by the people of Denver in order to hold ourselves, to hold their police department to a higher standard. And that is important to note, particularly as we work through this tragedy.
But overall, do you think it was used correctly? I mean, just preliminary?
Preliminary, absolutely. Estevan, thank you.
Hancock, it was just announced that an arrest was made in the case of Mr. Floyd. Your thoughts on that? The officer in question was arrested.
Well, you might recall, God, I can't remember when I posted that statement, but I called for the officers to be brought to justice, and that This is just the same video you saw. I sat there and watched it, and the same reaction, painful. They need to be brought to justice, and so I'm glad an arrest was made. I don't know what more evidence you needed to show that George Floyd was murdered on that street. Let me go to Stefan's question as well. I think the chief answered it well, but I think it's also important to kind of lift the veil in terms of how we prepared for yesterday. Again, Chief Pazen and Director Murphy and I had a phone conference, video conference, as we all are doing, just yesterday, many hours before the protests. We would continue to follow the values that we had followed in the past, whether it was Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Step Back, Perimeter, allow for the demonstration to occur, and God willing, it will go peacefully, and the officers wouldn't have to engage. Our officers do not show up in riot gear that you might see in other cities. They show up in their uniforms, standing again on the peripheral of the demonstration. It's a very difficult decision to have to make, to put the officers, tell the officers to don their riot gear, which had to happen last night. They did not show up wearing the riot gear. They had to put it on after they came under attack, with bottles being thrown at them and other rocks and other elements. And so that was something that I don't think we've had to do much in Denver during these demonstrations, but our officers had to protect themselves, and that's why you saw them do that, and then ultimately have to try to disperse the crowd with the other elements like pepper balls and what have you. So.
Along those lines with the use of force, are there any guidelines or next steps for folks who are caught in the crossfire? So, for instance, I saw a smoke grenade light a homeless person's tent on fire on Colfax. Like, what is the guidelines for folks who are kind of stuck in the middle of all this?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you can go to the independent monitor. We have obviously. They can file a complaint with the police department. The concern, the officers are trying to abate a pretty dangerous situation. No one targeted homeless tents or homeless individuals or even innocent individuals who were bystanders. The goal was to abate and to de-escalate the situation last night. And when that happens with that number of folks, unfortunately, you're going to have those who might be injured and might get in the crossfire of the pepper balls and then the pepper spray. And so that's unfortunate. I saw reporters, as I was watching it live on television, become victims of the pepper spray. They were not the intended target. They were not trying to disperse, but they were unfortunately there in the space, and as a result were taken by it as well. Greg? Brian?
Hancock, both of you, Chief Pazen, referred to a handful of agitators who showed up and disrupted things. These folks, are they affiliated with any group as far as you know? Were any of them arrested? And what purpose do you think they came out for? Why do you think they came out?
I'll let Chief speak for what he knows. Let me tell you what I know just based on some of the information that I received personally from people that I know who were out last night. There were folks who showed up with bats, for example, who were not part of the original group. They showed up later. There were folks who showed up and were trying to encourage people to pick up rocks and to throw them at the police officers. I've heard from people directly who said, you know what, they approached my children to do this. It's that kind of stuff that we know was taking place yesterday to try to incite the crowd or try to incite violence and get the officers to react. Again, I think it says a lot about the men and women of our police department and our sheriff deputies who showed restraint and discipline, not to react, but to act according to the policies and at the direction of their leadership in terms of what will help de-escalate the situation without causing great injury or harm to other individuals. Chief?
Chief, let me just give that question again, if I can. These people who showed up, do you have any reason to believe they're affiliated with any particular group? Do you think they just showed up with bad intentions to cause trouble? Who were these agitators you're talking about?
So you're right. It was a handful of folks that really caused the most damage, that really created the most danger. Showing up to a protest with baseball bats and hitting our business sector, also engaging in violence amongst other protesters is not what this is all about. It devalues the message. It takes away from the loss of life, the tragic loss of life that people gathered to have their voices heard. And unfortunately, we don't have a specific group that showed up that we could tie this to. There were folks that really caused significant disruptions, and we don't know the reason or the manner behind it. However, we are committed to hold these people accountable for their actions. And there were 13 arrests for criminal behavior. This is burglary, this is criminal mischief, this is assaults that took place, and we will continue to investigate. We will continue to utilize all tools that we have to identify victims, try to reach out to the victims to offer support, as well as to hold the individuals accountable for the crimes that they committed to the people of Denver and to this community.
One follow-up question, if I can. With respect to use of less lethal, what was the tipping point for you? What was the one incident where you said, okay, green light to use less lethal? What happened? Was it the car hitting people? Was it rocks and bottles? What precisely was the tipping point?
So again, and this was made for each individual location. So typically, the tipping point on this was officers having rocks hurled at them. We have an officer that was hit in the head with a rock and was taken to Denver Health Medical Center. He stayed there for several hours. He's doing well now, but we all know the dangers involved with hurling rocks. And to go hands-on is actually more combative, right? That's something, going hands-on with folks can actually create more of a danger for both our community members and the public. The less lethal deployment is done as a lower level approach to disperse crowds, and those decisions were made in reaction primarily to the crowd, some members, some portions of the crowds that were attempting to incite violence and throw rocks and other objects at police officers.
Question from Lance first, and then we'll go to Val. Go ahead, Lance.
Thank you.
A number of those incidents were caught on camera, and this gentleman made reference to an individual in a car that apparently hit somebody and then wasn't satisfied with just one, but turned around and kind of did it again. Incidents where vandals are breaking windshields on law enforcement vehicles, even up at the state capitol, and that's kind of the second part of the question too. If that's the state patrol's bailiwick, do they investigate that, and would they charge that, or is that something that Denver Police Department's going to be involved with? And overall, how hard do you go after those people? What will you charge them with? And will they actually be held accountable, or will charges be dropped later on?
So certainly we will not stand by and let this type of activity take place. And we're very well aware, we have done some investigation, and the investigation continues to the incident involving the vehicle and the individual who appears to have been struck by that vehicle. We do not have a victim at this time. We're asking the public's help to identify who this person is so we can ensure that they get medical attention. And our investigation is focused on identifying the driver of this vehicle. We do have some pretty solid evidence with regards to that. And similarly, if an individual engages in criminal behavior, we will work tirelessly to hold them accountable for those actions. And that does include damage to motorists, again, that were just caught in the crossfire. We have folks that were just trying to get home that unintentionally drove through the crowd or drove near where the crowd was, and there were a small set of individuals who then caused damage to folks that were just trying to get out of the way. And we will absolutely follow up on all of those crimes in an effort to hold people accountable for them.
Another question in the back? Go ahead.
Yes, hi. Mayor Hancock, I have a question for you. You did a great job in speaking about your thoughts on what's happened nationally with the death of Mr. Floyd. And yesterday you had a reference in the Denverite, which is one I read, that spoke about how you felt that those officers should be, or those involved, should be arrested. Where I would like to have your feedback on, and the question that I have is, while we're looking at the national situation of those who have been harmed by law enforcement, I have to ask you, why then don't we ask for the deputies who killed Marvin Booker to be held accountable for murder? Because his death was the same as what happened with Mr. Floyd in many ways, and there's no reference of either Mr. Booker or Mr. Marshall or anybody locally, and the question is very, I ask it with much respect, and that is, the history is very important, and I think that there may be some tensions that are still fueled and held in the community just because of what's happened here locally. Can you address that, and can you speak about why those who have done harm should not be held accountable in our own city?
No, absolutely. You know, these incidents locally also continue to be opportunities for us to learn, and I did learn a lot. I came in as the Booker case was being adjudicated. Quite frankly, that case was well on its way. Those sheriff deputies were also dealt with in an investigation under my administration after the final verdict from the court and determination from the district attorney and from others. You know, we did handle that. Same thing with the Marshall case. The reality is that following each of those incidents, there were tremendous lessons learned from me personally, but also from my administration. There are different protocols we follow the moment those type of incidents happen. I'm usually on the phone with the victim's family, regardless of what the disposition is, as well as with the police officers who were involved, and guaranteeing them swift investigation. It's the same thing that occurred in terms of what's in Minneapolis. As the Attorney General of Minneapolis said this morning, not only do we want the wheels of justice to churn, but we want the wheels of justice to churn swiftly in this issue. Everyone, unfortunately, George Floyd was not allowed to have the benefit of the doubt, and for that justice will to turn, it was taken care of on the street. Booker, Marshall, but doesn't mean that we should abandon their due process, and those things should happen. But I always called for swift justice, and to make sure that as a mayor I lean in and promise the family we're going to do everything we can to bring swift justice and I think solutions to the challenge that we face with regards to your family. I have met with the Marshall family. I sat with them. I cried with them. I prayed with them, even as we were dealing with those situations. But they always had my word that I would do everything I could to make sure that it was a swift resolution, and that as a city we would do everything we can to help bring comfort to them, but also allow them to move on in their lives. So yeah, lessons have been learned. But what I saw in Minneapolis, that needed to move quickly, swiftly for the family as well as for the community. Yeah. John?
For Chief Pazen, how many officers were on the scene around the protests at the beginning last night, and how many were there later in the evening? What were those numbers like?
So by no means are we dodging this question, but we do not give numbers of officers for any types of tactical situations. The reason is truly in order to continue to protect the community. This type of information could be used against not only the police department, but certainly a community. So we work closely to identify the number of officers needed, the approach, as the mayor spoke of. Again, every intention on this was in a collaborative way. We worked closely with the organizers, communicated the route, the path. We blocked traffic so that way these protesters on foot would not be harmed by vehicles crossing traffic. We worked out different ways to get that voice heard, as well as how to return back to the Capitol safely. And unfortunately, a small group chose to break off and cause potential harm both to themselves by jumping on the highway, as well as to folks that are unaware of pedestrians on the highway. We absolutely work closely with the community, but as far as sharing total numbers, that would be something that we could not share at this time.
And as far as the route, did the demonstrators generally follow the route that was prescribed or that they gave to you?
I want to give credit to the organizers last night. They did initially follow. We worked closely with them as far as making sure that they could go down the mall safely, that they could get over to Coors Field safely, that they could go down Chestnut safely, and then their plan was to return back down the mall again towards the state capitol, and unfortunately that's when other folks decided to do something different. Again, this was a challenging situation, but we will extend our arm to future protests, again, to work in a cooperative way to do this safely. It is vitally important that people get their voices heard. If folks want to affect change in this city, we stand ready to work with them, and we have demonstrated that with this very strong use of force policy. We have demonstrated that with community involvement in training for the use of force policy, and we have demonstrated that with the transparency of sharing use of force data publicly on our website on an annual basis. And if there are, we've come a long way, but by no means can we plant the flag and say we've mission accomplished. We have a long way to go, but you hear it from the city, you hear it from this mayor, this safety director, and this police chief, that we will work with the community for positive change so we can avoid tragedies in the community that we love.
A couple more questions. Rob, go ahead.
Chief, my sergeant says there was a fatal stabbing yesterday in the 1500 block of South Broadway. Any reason to believe that was related to the protest?
Rob, actually, I'm glad that you bring this up, right? We're talking about the sanctity of life. We're talking about the sanctity of life in our community. This is a member of our homeless community, people experiencing homeless. This person was experiencing homelessness. There was a violent confrontation, and we have the suspect in custody. But when we're talking about vulnerable populations, we have an individual in our community that lost their life yesterday. Fortunately, officers, again, this is completely separate from the protest. We have no reason to believe that they were that they were related. Officers responded. They were investigating. They set up a perimeter, and they were fortunate to locate and apprehend the person that we believe is responsible for this crime. But it is important that we recognize all life, whether it's in Minneapolis, whether it's in Denver or any other part of the country, is important and valued. And it's a tragedy that this person, this vulnerable person, lost their life yesterday in our city.
Last question, please. Go ahead.
Mayor Hancock, you spoke to it, but were you 100% satisfied with the way officers handled the situation yesterday, and how would you suggest that they handle it today? Any differently?
You know what, in debriefing with the chief this morning, there are always lessons learned in every situation of this magnitude. I mean, they're reacting very quickly, very swiftly to very quick changing conditions. I can tell you that I watched just about every minute of the protests yesterday from video feed, and I watched as the officers responded. They showed tremendous restraint. They showed tremendous discipline, and that's greatly appreciated. I think that we ought to acknowledge the fact that with people yelling in your face, people hurling rocks at you, that our officers demonstrated tremendous restraint and discipline and didn't allow for the situation to escalate, and it could have escalated very quickly. And I'm grateful to them. We all are grateful to them that they did not allow that to happen. Okay.
What about how they should handle themselves?
They're going to, our officers, as Chief pointed out, and I think I said it earlier, we're going to follow the same protocol. We're going to perimeter, and we're going to allow the demonstration to go forward. What we will not tolerate is vandalism, violence, that puts people, whether they are demonstrators or the police, in danger. And the officers will be prepared for that, and they'll have additional resources to make sure that they're able to handle it. But again, we got to remind everyone, and as we get ready to close this, we are still in the era of coronavirus. COVID-19 has not left our community. It's still here. If you're demonstrating, we strongly encourage you to demonstrate peacefully, but remind you that the orders of face coverings is still in effect. To remind you that you are strongly encouraged for your own protection to maintain 6 feet distance from each other, and to do it peacefully. And let not your actions become the story. Let's remind ourselves to keep the life that was lost, George Floyd, at the forefront of our marching. For every step that we take, let's remind ourselves of his last words, "I cannot breathe. I can't breathe. Mama, help me." And let's remind ourselves that as a community, we still battle this disease of hatred, of racism. And it's going to be us who have to stay united and get through it and not allow the actions of a few to become the story. Thank you all for being here, and God bless you.